welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. You're here today for Kylee Van Horn's clinic about endurance fueling. First, I'm just going to do a quick little intro and then let Kylee get started. So for those who don't know, my name is Tim and I'm the content manager at Gnarly Nutrition. And if you aren't super familiar with the brand, Gnarly offers a full line of all natural NSF sports nutrition products. Gnarly's nutrition is for athletes and individuals who pay attention to what goes inside their bodies. We pride ourselves on our line of taste, effectiveness, and transparency. So throughout this entire month of June, our fueling clinics will be revealing the nutritional and mental aspects of fueling. Two things that are super cool about this month's lineup that we haven't done in the past, or that relate to this one in particular, is that first, donations from these fueling clinics directly support a Space Below Your Feet BIPOC scholarship. Space Below Your Feet is a woman-led organization that focuses on positively impacting the individuals who participate in one of their retreats and the communities that the organization visits during the retreat. Gnarly athlete Genevieve Walker started the scholarship with Space Below Your Feet to help make this kind of climbing and community experience available to someone who may not have been able to participate otherwise. So big thanks to everyone who donated. The other awesome thing about these fueling clinics is that they're taking place while we launch Fuel 2.0. Fuel 2.0 was created with recovery and replenishment in mind and is the carb-based all-in-one fueling solution for long days on the trail. Excuse me, on the trails, in the mountains, or at the crag. Be sure to pre-order Fuel 2.0 on our website, and if you use the code FUELClinic15 at checkout, you'll get 15% off your order of Fuel 2.0, and that discount will last until July 4th. And at the end of this clinic, there's a brief survey that will pop up. If you have an extra minute, it would be awesome if you could fill that out so we can get some feedback from all of you. And after all this is over, we'll send a recording of this clinic to everyone who's registered, as well as the discount code that I just mentioned. So if you miss that, you'll get that, so don't worry. All right, so now what you've been waiting for, I'd like to introduce Kylee. I'm just gonna read her bio real quick. Kylee is an endurance sports dietitian who takes a balanced, sustainable approach to fueling for performance. A competitive trail runner herself, she's on a mission to change the message in the endurance community to separate facts from fads and change the message from skinnier is better to one that celebrates performance no matter the body size. Today, Kylee is the founder and owner of her sports nutrition business, Flynutrition, which helps runners, triathletes, and skiers to learn not only the why, but the how behind fueling for performance. She is a freelance writer for Trail Runner magazine, and has contributed to Outside Online. Beyond her work in endurance sports nutrition, Kylee can be found running peaks near Aspen, Colorado, with her two Australian shepherds and ultra endurance husband, Sean. In this clinic, Kylee will cover everything you need to know to prepare for and execute on your fueling strategy for your big day. So now I'll pass it over to Kylee. Make her the host.
All right.
And you
Let me
should
just share. Yeah, I think we're good to go. I'm gonna share the screen here and present.
Perfect.
Awesome. So I'm really excited to be here. This is my first time speaking on behalf of Gnarly Nutrition. And when I was trying to think of what I was going to talk about today, I tried to think of what a lot of athletes that I'm working with right now are struggling with. And I came up with inter-workout fueling was a really big one. A lot of people are racing again. And so I decided that I would really focus on pre, inter, and post workout fueling today. So let me, oops. So I just wanted to give a little background about myself. I know he just read my bio, but I am, as he mentioned, I'm a registered dietitian. I originally was a pre-veterinary major, biology major at the University of Richmond. And then I got my degree in human nutrition from Metro State University in Denver. I completed my dietetic internship from the University of Northern Colorado in 2018. And so I passed my RD exam then. And so I've been a dietitian for almost 3 years now. Athletic wise, I did run D1 track and field and cross country at the University of Richmond. And I dabbled a bit post college in the marathon. I tried to qualify for the trials and missed that by a little bit. And then I met my husband and started to get into trail running and ski mountaineering, Nordic skiing. So I do more of that realm of things these days. A little bit about my philosophy, and you'll probably kind of pick up on this throughout the presentation, is I do really like to individualize everything that I'm doing with each athlete that I'm working with. I like to use science to kind of guide my recommendations. So I'm not really about fad diets. I'm not really about restrictive dieting. And I try to give sound nutrition advice when I am working with people. And then a really big thing that I focus on is not only having an understanding behind like why you want to make certain changes, but the how. And so when I'm going through the presentation, I want you all to think about how can I apply these things or these examples to my currently what I'm doing. And if you have anything specifically that you're doing and you want me to, answer a quick question or take a look at it, I'm happy to do that if you email me after the session. So as I mentioned, one of the top nutrition mistakes I see endurance athletes make is not dialing in their fueling for longer efforts and races. So I get a lot of requests from athletes that they want to dial in a fueling plan 2 weeks before their big event. So normally that is not something I would recommend. I like for people to, I think it's very important to dial in the pre, during, and post for a big event long before the event. So 2 to 3 months beforehand is kind of the minimum that I give. And those that are training for really long events might want to even consider giving themselves a little bit longer. So I kind of want to start with thinking about that pre-long workout or race training meal. And typically this is going to be in the morning. So that's where I usually focus on with examples. Now, if you're doing a night race, you might want to also take some similar considerations, and that might come into play if you're doing a overnight ultra or ski mountaineering event. But I want you to make sure that you're considering trying to practice this in your actual training before your big event day. And so what I usually say to the athletes I'm working with is think about your long day of activity as like your big kind of mock like race or adventure simulation every single week. So consistency with that and trying to figure out what is going to work for you is going to be the best strategy. The advantage to that is it's going to allow for you to have some gut adaptations to occur. And you're also going to be able to figure out, oh, like I might not be able to tolerate this amount of food or this specific food during, before or after. So typically when you're looking at doing like a pre-long workout meal, I wanted to kind of clarify that the meal status I usually classify as 75 to 90 minutes plus for duration of activity. And so when we're looking at that duration of activity, we are going to want to make sure that we give ourselves enough time to digest. And I know there's people out there that are going to be like, well, I really don't I like to use my long day on my weekend as a time to sleep in. And I do understand that. I do think that if you're the type of person that does want to get more sleep even before your race, then you are going to want to consider the choices that you're making when you're building your like pre-workout, pre-long workout, pre-long race training meal. Target wise, I usually give like a general calorie guideline for long things, 500 up to 700 to 900 calories. So if you're not used to that amount of energy intake, that might be something to work towards. If we're looking at carbohydrate content, we want to go with, and this meal should mostly contain carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates, probably going to be the best choice because they're most easily digested. So we're looking at 1 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight there. And so if you are a 110-pound female, that might look like 50 grams of carbs. But if you're much bigger than that, a much bigger person than that, you are going to want to go up, and that's on the low end of things. To get your weight in kilograms, you would take your weight divided by 2.2, just as a reference there. You are going to want to keep the fiber low in the meal that you're choosing to do. So I usually say about less than 5 grams of fiber. And that is reason for that being higher incidence of or risk of GI distress. We also don't necessarily want to have more digestion having to occur before a big event because we want to get kind of that more quick, steady, but quick energy. And we don't want to stress out that GI system. Lower fat options tend to be better. So 5 to 10 grams is usually the guideline I give. And then a little bit of protein, I would say, is something you want to consider including. So about 8 to 10 grams, maybe a little bit more. And that what that protein is going to do is it's going to allow for the carbohydrates to be released into the bloodstream a little bit more slowly. And so it won't necessarily cause a huge spike and drop in blood sugar. It's going to allow for more of that steady energy as you're getting ready for your event. And then fluid wise, I like to say doing a serving of electrolytes in 16 to 24 ounces of water is a good option. You can either do just plain electrolyte or your hydration mix. If you are timing this out 2 to 4 hours before activity, you might want to consider in the 30 to 60 minutes before your actual event, doing a little bit more to top things off in regards to either having like a half a banana or a gel or a waffle or something like that to just kind of top off your stores and make sure you're ready to go. So I have a few examples here of good pre-long workout and race foods. So a good one to kind of point out is this oatmeal. So a lot of athletes I work with, they're used to doing oatmeal before a big long run. So what I try to mention is, that oatmeal is going to be a really filling high fiber option. So thinking about switching over those whole rolled oats to maybe a quick cook oatmeal, because that's going to be easier to digest. Some honey, a banana, and some juice. You might want to add in a little bit of nut butter there to kind of give a little bit of extra protein to kind of keep the blood sugar stabilized a little bit. Then there's some other options here. I give a few savory options too. Some people don't really like a lot of sweet things. So consideration of sweet potato or quinoa, those sorts of things, those can be good options, even though they might sound out of the ordinary. But again, what you want to do is make sure that you're practicing with this every single week in and out on that long day so you can kind of get used to what you're choosing to do. And then I kind of just wanted to reiterate the purpose of that pre-long workout race meal. We're going to be topping off our glycogen or stored carbohydrate in the body. We also want to top off fluids and electrolytes, make sure we're good to go there. Again, it needs to be practiced. And then keeping in mind that timing, the wrong food combinations and amount of food all need to be trialed before race day. So again, this goes back to consistency, doing this week in and week out, because if you trial something a week before, might not necessarily go very well on race day. And so, all that training you're doing, trying to put in a little bit of effort into that nutrition piece is going to be key. Now, this is kind of the bread and butter of what I wanted to talk about today, this long workout or race fueling. And so normally when I'm talking to athletes about this, I usually mention that there's three main components that we want to really pay attention to when we're building a fueling plan. So we want to pay attention to our calorie intake per hour, which can also be divided down into carbohydrate intake per hour. For longer events, we might want to look at fat and protein intake per hour as well. Then we have our sodium intake per hour, which other electrolytes are important, but I'm going to go into the role of sodium and its importance in a fueling plan. It kind of plays a key role. And then your fluids per hour. And so what can happen if one of these components is off when you are fueling during your big event or big adventure? That is where we tend to see more stomach issues occurring. And so if you get to the point where you're having stomach issues, it's probably a result of one of these three things. And so once you get to that point, one of the only options is kind of slowing down and trying to re-regulate the body with one of these options. So first off, looking at the carbohydrate component of all of this. So the purpose of carbohydrates is making sure that we are able to perform to the top level of kind of our fitness. And allows for us to maintain higher carbohydrate oxidation rates and our endurance capacity. So what that means is you're able to go harder, longer, and keep up a regular, steady pace. And so if you're thinking like, oh, well, if I'm going and doing an ultra long event, I might be going slower. Well, yes, that is true. You might be incurring hills. If you're doing something like a Nordic or mountain bike race, you do tend to have bursts of high speed, high intensity efforts mixed in there. So carbohydrates are going to be a really key component in that fueling plan. Carbohydrates are going to prevent hypoglycemia from occurring. And then they're also going to allow for effective central nervous system functioning. So the longer you're going, you want to be able to think a little bit clearly when you're out there. So carbohydrates play a role in that. Protein and amino acids also play a role in that, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. And then a big topic, especially in the ultra endurance running world, is using fats as a fuel source. So I just want to make note that we are always using fats for fuel. It's just at a different rate depending on the percentage of VO2 max that we're working at. So we are working at about 65 to 70% of our VO2 max. We do tend to utilize more carbohydrate. We are still using some fats as fuel. If you are going extreme low carb, it can potentially affect your endurance capacity, which is going to impact performance, which I did touch on before. And then oxidation of carbohydrates give 10% more energy per liter of oxygen than fats. So there's a lower oxygen demand utilizing carbohydrates than if you were to utilize fats for fuel. There is a risk with utilizing fats for fuel with heart stress. And it's not, so essentially it's not as efficient of a process for energy production. And so typically your exercise intensity is going to have to be decreased so that your ATP or energy production can match ATP or energy use. Now, I'm not going to say that some athletes can or can't utilize more fats for energy production and become more fat adapted. But for the general population, the risks typically outweigh the benefits. So I do tend to recommend sticking with carbohydrates as your main source of fuel during an event. And then going into, so if we look at types of carbohydrates, there's going to be kind of a couple of different types that we're going to look at in regards to what we want to include in our fueling plan. So if we're looking at, there is one type of transporter called the SGLT1 transporter, which relies on sodium. It is found in the small intestine. And then there's also the GLUT5 transporter, which is the fructose transporter, and it's also found in the small intestine. So when we're looking at different types of carbs and what to include, we look at our glucose kind of carbohydrate options, and then we look at our fructose as well. And so the difference between the two, fructose is typically processed or transported across the small intestine at a much slower rate than glucose is. So keeping that in mind when building your plan. It can be important to include fructose in addition to glucose, sucrose, and other oligosaccharides, because we want to, if we vary the sugar composition of the nutrition that we're including, we're able to utilize all of those transporters. If you think about it, if we're using just fructose or just glucose or sucrose, then we are limited by the number of transporters in the small intestine and our ability to kind of get those sugars across the small intestine. There are things like maltodextrin, which are actually glucose polymers or longer chains, which can increase carb content of your fueling options, but not the osmolality. And we'll talk about osmolality in a little bit. Too high of osmolality can cause issues with GI distress. So essentially, we want to include glucose and fructose, and I'll go in and glucose polymers, etc. So when we're looking at our recommended intake of carbohydrate, when we're looking at longer efforts over 2 hours, we do want to kind of look at a carb intake of about 60 to 90 grams per hour. Now, this can vary depending on the size of the athlete, male versus female, your kind of tolerance to certain sugars. Some people can't tolerate fructose as well. So that's where it's important that you really need to either work with somebody or really critically analyze your fueling plan to make sure that you're doing something that's appropriate for yourself. I did mention multiple transportable carbohydrate types. So again, we have a certain number, thinking of a door analogy. So if we have fructose transporters and glucose transporters, and we have more glucose molecules than doors, that can cause a backup of glucose molecules, or it's same thing with fructose in the small intestine, can cause GI issues. When you're looking at the choices that you're making, typically including a smaller amount of fructose to glucose or a 2-to-1 ratio is a good starting place. Again, because fructose is processed slower in the small intestine, so it can be much harder to get that fructose transported across and utilized. Looking at, I kind of liken this when I'm working with my athletes, thinking back to like high school biology or chemistry class. So if we do have a backup of molecules in the small intestine, that can cause a concentration gradient difference. And so what then can happen is water flows in to balance out the concentration gradient. It flows in from outside the small intestine from the bloodstream, and can cause gas, bloating, cramping, and GI issues. And then what we also see from that is a dehydration issue. So all of the things that we don't want to be experiencing. So that's kind of that carbohydrate piece. And I'm going to put all of these pieces together after I go through all of them. And you'll see how they all interconnect. The next piece is going to be that sodium electrolyte piece. And mainly focusing on sodium here because it does play a key role in so many different areas when we are exercising, and we tend to lose the most sodium through sweat, etc. So the purpose of sodium is going to be muscle contractions. It can affect heartbeat, nerve transmission, and back to the sugars, it can affect the glucose ability to get transported across the small intestine. And then it also does help with stimulation of thirst and fluid uptake when you're exercising. So general recommendation wise, there is, the general 250 to 500 milligrams of sodium per hour tends to be a good starting place. If you're somebody that is a salty sweater and you tend to have a lot of white crystals on you after you're done exercising, you might want to consider going higher. You could consider getting a sweat test done. There's a couple of companies that do at-home sweat tests. So Levelin or Gatorade. Gatorade is a new one. They have a new patch that you can use at home. Or there's an in-person precision hydration test. And you can look in your area to see if anywhere offers one of those. And those tests can be a little bit more dialed for helping you figure out how much sodium per hour you need to be aiming for. You can also look at other electrolytes lost as well. And then this can vary depending on your personal sweat rate, and then in hotter or more humid conditions, also higher altitudes, you may need to increase your electrolyte or sodium consumption. There's a couple of different ways that you can get electrolytes in during activity. So a hydration mix, or from something like salt tabs or pills. And I'm going to go into kind of the advantages and disadvantages here in a sec. And then we've got our fluid consumption per hour. And so the purpose of the fluid consumption per hour is, this one is typically most obvious to people, but we want to prevent dehydration, which can affect your fatigue levels and your performance. So even a 2 to 3% drop in body weight from fluids, we do see performance affected. A starting intake, I typically recommend 16 to 20 ounces an hour, but this can really, really vary depending on the climate and individual sweat rates of a person. So if you're in a colder climate, 10 to 12 ounces sometimes works as a good starting place. Hotter climates, you might even need more than 20 ounces an hour. But again, working through that in your training is a good starting place. If you experience like frequent urination, sloshing stomach, bloating, and fullness, that could be an indicator that you are drinking too much per hour. So if you are practicing things and you notice any of these symptoms, that might be an indicator, okay, maybe I need to adjust this a little bit. I do want to point out that if you're not used to taking in this intake, it can be a bit difficult to work towards. So what I suggest is, if you're at 8 ounces an hour, maybe you just start at a 10 ounce per hour and you slowly increase, just kind of see where that mark is for you in regards to like urinating more, etc. So maybe you don't need to be at 16 to 20 ounces an hour, but just again, kind of utilizing your own situation to figure this out. And then I just wanted to touch on that osmolality piece that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So osmolality, what is it? So it's a number of particles in a given solution. And so where this comes to into play is when I work with athletes that they tend to up the amount of hydration mix or electrolytes in their formula or their water bottle. And so they're like, oh, I'll get in more nutrition by just going over the recommended amounts of what these sports nutrition formulas recommend. So what can happen is that those solutions then become essentially too concentrated and can cause GI distress if you are not monitoring the proper amount of fluid intake that you're taking in. So if you have something that's super concentrated, be aware that this can become an issue and you need to be really cognizant of how much you're taking in per hour. So we really are desiring to take in a solution that is iso or hypo, so kind of equal to or under the concentration of blood plasma, because that's where, as I was mentioning earlier with the door analogy, if there's too many particles in the small intestine, water is going to flow in from the blood plasma and dehydrate you and cause stomach issues. So I want to talk, this is a really, really big component of when I'm working with athletes. I focus hard on having them analyze all of the products that they're choosing to use for inter-workout long fueling, and then also for race day. So what are they considering? And so we're trying to figure out what exactly your targets are, and then trying to set up a plan that kind of fits targets for yourself. So not just guessing and saying, oh, 1 gel an hour and this hydration mix is going to meet my needs. Actually breaking it down and looking very closely at the calorie intake, carbohydrate intake, fluid intake, and sodium intake. So I listed this general starting targets for y'all here, and then I'm going to show you how you can put this together for yourself. So first off, step one is kind of choosing your vehicle for fluid transport and fluid intake pattern. I know for some of you, this sounds like really intuitive and straightforward, but some people have never done this before, and there need to be considerations for the sport that you're doing. So making sure you have an option, whether it is a hydration vest, whether it is bottles on your bike, whether it's a handheld, you really need to consider like what type of event you're doing and how you're going to get in fluids. I did also mention this earlier, but when you're building your fluid intake plan, trying to maybe start with a lower end fluid target, and then working your way up. And then the other consideration that you want to make is your patterning. And so a lot of people don't even consider like, oh, how often do I need to take in 3 to 4 ounces of fluid? Or what is the best fluid intake pattern for me? Like, do I want to drip it in every couple minutes? Or do I want to take in 3 to 4 ounces every 15 minutes? So thinking about what your intake pattern is going to be, and then trying to figure out how to remind yourself to take in those fluids. So oftentimes I will have athletes set up either, it can be annoying at first, but set up like a beeper on your watch or have it written on your hand, just some kind of like visual or audio reminder for yourself to get in the patterning. Once you start to get in that patterning and dial it in, you can kind of try to back away from that, because I mean, a lot of us don't necessarily want to be having that beep every like 5 seconds. But in order to kind of practice this, you need to have some kind of reminder. Then we want to look at choosing a hydration or electrolyte option. So consideration of if you're somebody that has done this in the past and you are trying to tweak your fueling plan and you're like, well, I can't use those hydration mixes, they're just too sweet. There are options for people that don't like as sweet of things. You can do electrolyte kind of just like supplements that you put in your water. So base salts is one of them. And I'll show a picture of them in a second. Your noon tablets or trace mineral drops. So you still want to pay attention to, you're aiming for 250 to 500 milligrams of sodium intake per hour. So you do want to make sure that you are putting enough of that electrolyte into your actual bottle and aiming for that particular intake amount. Now, the upside of hydration mix, like the Gnarly Fuel 2.0, is that it's also going to provide liquid calories. You just need to keep in mind that sugar composition, as I was mentioning, when you are combining it with other food or gel options. The, I guess, potential downside of doing a like a pill, electrolyte supplement pill or a chew, is that it is a big hit of electrolyte at one time. So just being careful with how much of those you use, and then when you're using them, how often you're using them, because it can be hard on some people's systems. Then step 3 is going to be choosing a gel, chew, or food blend option. And so I usually like for athletes to do this. Not saying you have to be a fan of taking in gels or sticky gels or like blocks or anything like that. You can choose an option like a Spring Energy food blend. I have recipes on my website where you can make your own food blends that I've nutritionally analyzed, and you can put them in a reusable flask. But having some kind of option like this, because especially at the beginning of your event, doing something that's a quick, like easily digestible carbohydrate source is going to be beneficial for, typically we're going a little bit harder at the beginning of a longer event. So doing something that is easily digestible, easily consumable. And then the other advantage is if you are really far into an event and you just can't take in regular solid food, this is an option to kind of squirt something into your mouth. So it's something else, as I say, this covers all your bases. So you may not use it for the entire effort, but it is a convenient way to kind of cover all your bases. I do recommend, there is a note here, that if you're choosing more than one option, you want to try to keep at a similar calorie content and nutrition makeup. And I'll go into this later a little bit more, but it is going to benefit you greatly to do this, because as you get further into a long event, you typically get, like, your brain gets foggy, you're not thinking, you're probably not going to be thinking about, oh, I had hour 5 on my plan, I was going to have this gel at this time. So if you have similar nutrition makeup of the options you're choosing, it can benefit you and you won't have to think about it quite as much. And then if you are doing something longer, so over 2 to 3 hours, I do recommend kind of switching, having some options for yourself for like solid food. You're typically going to be slowing your pace down a little bit. You might at this point not be wanting to take in as much of the sweet options. So considering including some savory options versus sweet options. And then you also want to consider, though, when making these choices, what is the portability of these options that I'm going to include? And then what is the digestibility of these options that I'm going to include? So I do recommend, and I didn't make it a separate section in the building your fueling plan thing, but I do recommend after the 3-hour mark, trying to include some protein in your fueling plan to allow for, try to prevent additional muscle protein breakdown. And then it can provide a little bit of a mental boost as well, amino acid wise. So some protein is okay, but trying not to do too much fiber, again, going back to that, it's much harder to digest thing. And then not too much fat, though some people can handle more fat than others. So again, keeping in mind, the choices that you're making for you and not comparing what you're doing to other people. So I put in some food options for fueling here. So I give this to a lot of my athletes because it does have the breakdown of a kind of a serving of these particular foods that a lot of endurance athletes that I work with utilize. And so it makes it nice when you're trying to put together your plan as to some things that are common go-tos. So some ones that really stick out or tend to be popular, and one is not even on here. So it was a picture on the other slide of gnocchi, which is like the potato pasta. And so you can usually get those, and actually they're very like poppable and portable. You can put some salt on those, really great savory option. Your like peanut butter and jelly Uncrustables are really popular with triathletes and ultra runners. The boiled potatoes with salt is a pretty standard option. And then doing things, a new one, pierogies. That's one that some athletes I'm working with are actually experimenting with. So, you know, taking a look at some of these options and thinking about, okay, maybe this would be good to add to my own fueling plan. And then how to put it together. So for a lot of people, they've just done a basic fueling plan. They've never really analyzed what is in their fueling plan. Again, if it fits together. So like I was saying, like fluids, electrolytes, carbohydrates, calorie, all these things, really breaking it down nutritionally to see if it fits together. So I created an Excel sheet that all my athletes use, and as part of their homework, they do break down their actual fueling plan. I have on here, and you can make something similar. You can choose a hydration or electrolyte mix, your gel, food blend, or gummy option, and then you can put food options in here as well. For longer events, like ultra marathon events, you might want to, you know, make multiple food columns. So you test like 4 different food options. Thinking about when you're putting this in here, timing of intake is one that I did mention earlier. Making sure you analyze the sugar makeup of the things you're choosing. So where this comes into play most is looking at that hydration mix. Does the hydration mix have fructose in it? If the hydration mix has fructose in it, you need to be careful with the gels and the foods that you're choosing, because if you choose an option like fruit that as your food choice that does have fructose in it, that could potentially cause GI issues. Same thing with if you're choosing candy like gummy worms or just gummy candies mixed with a hydration mix that has fructose in it. So being careful of those things is important when you're building this up. And then looking at, I have the protein in here as well, aiming for 5 to 10 grams per hour after the 3-hour mark. So that's something you want to maybe consider. And you could get protein sources in from things like BCAAs. You can also take it when you take in potatoes, you're going to get some protein in, nut butters, etc. So really, this is a really great way to break it down, visualize what you're going to do, and you then have the confidence going into your event that you have done this. You've done this homework, you've practiced it, and made it happen. A few side notes on this. Some of the tips that I work with people on are trying to, so as I mentioned with the gels, trying to standardize the nutrition content of them. So maybe between 90 and 110 calories for your gels and food blends. And then when you're looking at your food options, thinking about standardizing the portion size of your food options as well. So for instance, like a Fig Newton serving is like 110 calories for 2. And maybe your potatoes, 2 potatoes is 200 calories. So what I would recommend doing is looking at the rest of your fueling plan, thinking about how many calories you're going to have to get from your food to meet your calorie goals, and then standardizing that food choice to a specific serving. So if it's 110 calories, 2 Fig Newtons would be that, maybe 1 potato, maybe half a PB&J Uncrustable. And so if you standardize it and break it into equal baggies, that allows for you later on in your event, if you become like kind of foggy, you can choose these options and keep track of the calories that you're consuming. So it makes it much easier to kind of ensure that you're getting in the right amount of nutrition without thinking about, oh, what did I have on this plan at hour 2? What was I going to take in, or hour 10? And you forget what you were planning on doing. The hydration mix should stay pretty standard the whole event. So keeping that in mind. Now I want to touch on a few special sport specific considerations. So I do work with mountain bikers, Nordic skiers, ski mountaineers, triathletes, runners, And so there are specific things that you want to consider when you are trying to get in your inter-workout nutrition. So mountain biking, thinking about that, it is very difficult when you're down, especially when you're downhill mountain biking, to kind of be taking in nutrition, thinking about a hydration pack, thinking about liquid nutrition, and maybe that is something that you need to consider. That might be the easier way for you to get in most of your nutrition on mountain bikes. So that is a consideration that you're going to want to take. Gels could be an easier option as well. Now, Nordic, the cold winter sports, there's definitely some things that you want to take into account. So freezing of liquids, so the temperature of which you're racing in or doing your adventure in. So adding something like sodium can help prevent freezing of that liquid. And side note, I did the Grand Traverse a couple of years ago, and it was really cold. Grand Traverse, for those who don't know, is a ski race from Crested Butte to Aspen in Colorado. And my husband and I did it together, and we put vodka in our water hydration pack, and it prevented the bottle and the hydration pack from freezing. So you just want to make sure that you're doing something to prevent that freezing of liquids. I'm not saying add a whole bottle of vodka here, but a little bit of something that can help prevent that freezing. Hydration packs may need to be considered for racing, and if you're using a tube, you are going to want to try to have an insulated tube and then blowing back excess fluid in it to prevent it from freezing. Another thing I did during that Grand Traverse race was I put the hydration bladder on the front and made sure that it was like underneath my main shirt to kind of help with prevention of freezing as well. And then if you're doing something maybe shorter and need some liquids, or even longer, consideration of utilizing hot liquids at the start to kind of get you further along without having the liquids freeze. For food options, if you're skiing, thinking about it, you have your poles. You would want to maybe staple your gels to a bib number if you're racing a Nordic race, and then pre-opening food options. So this is one some people don't think about, but even in like multi-day ultra running events, having your food options like the wrapper removed can save time and weight. So thinking about pre-opening those food options. And then for ultra trail running, for longer things, especially bringing baggies of hydration mix with you or electrolytes. As I mentioned earlier, like you're going to be out there for a while, you want to keep the hydration electrolyte intake consistent. You can have some like backup electrolyte pills, but I would suggest bringing your own like little baggies of mix that are pre-portioned out. Soft bottles with a filter cap are useful for backcountry effort. So if you're going for an FKT event or effort, or if you're doing something really long in the backcountry, the soft bottles with the filter cap are amazing. They have been like major lifesavers for me, and I don't have to stress about like where am I going to get more water at. And then pace is often a little bit slower. So I mentioned this earlier. You can include small amounts of fat, and you will want to include protein if possible above that 3-hour mark to try to prevent muscle protein breakdown. And then for all the triathletes out there, really considering your entire race fueling plan in regards to what are you going to do in transition, because that's a key place to get in nutrition. And then on the bike versus the run. So my triathletes oftentimes take in a lot more calories and carbohydrates on the bike because it's easier to get in nutrition and digest the things that you're taking in. And then when you get to the run, consideration of what am I going to do on that run? If you're planning on taking on-course nutrition for that triathlon, and say it's Gatorade Endurance and whatever gels are on the course, you want to still build that into your fueling plan, and you still want to be practicing with that. So you want to purchase some Gatorade Endurance, and you need to start trying to figure out, oh, what does it look like to take in 3 to 4 ounces of Gatorade Endurance on my runs? Is Gatorade Endurance going to work for me? And so all of these things are things that, sometimes we just overlook and we're like, oh, I'll just go with it. But that's where we end up getting ourselves into trouble. And then it would be remiss to chat about pre, inter, and not talk about post long workout and race nutrition. And this can really come into play when you're doing multiple racing events, when you are training really hard and doing long training days. It is going to be really important to try and get in good recovery nutrition. So typically, like if you're doing a meal, and it's 30 to 60 minutes in that, there's a post window, recovery window for longer efforts, then you are fine. You don't necessarily need to worry about this recommendation for target here. These targets are for if you're having like a post-workout snack. And so 1 gram per kilogram body weight for carbohydrates, and then about 20 grams of protein. So it ends up being about 240 to 340 calories. It's 45 to 60-ish grams of carbohydrates and 20 grams of protein. And so we want to make sure that we're having both of those to help with maximum muscle protein synthesis rates and glycogen storage rates. So if you are able to get in something within that first hour of finishing that does contain carbohydrate and protein, it can maximize your ability to replace those glycogen stores. The rates of glycogen replenishment are at their highest. And so that is why that is typically emphasized. Now, again, this is for like very long efforts over 90 minutes to 2 hours. If you're doing something shorter than that, if it's higher intensity, you might want to focus on this window. But if it's just shorter, easier, as long as you get in a meal within 1 to 3 or 4 hours afterwards, you should be pretty good. And then fluid wise, replacement of fluid lost during that activity. So you want to make sure that you are paying close attention to. You can always weigh yourself before and after, or pay attention to how much you're taking in during, but you do want to replenish both fluid and electrolyte that you lost during that activity, because that will affect training adaptations and recovery as well. And then again, that this purpose is restoration of body for the next performance. So we're replacing the fluids and electrolytes, muscle repair, replenishment of vitamins and minerals, and then restoration of glycogen stores in the muscle and liver. And then some ideas for those that are wondering. So I always like to take into consideration, like, are you doing your efforts away from home? So if you are, what do you need to consider there? Maybe you have a recovery mix that you keep in your car that you can have with carb and protein in it. If you're at home, maybe you want to make a smoothie. Liquid options are typically better for those that tend to lose their appetite, which can occur for hotter environments if you're at altitude. And then, the longer you go, sometimes your hunger and fullness hormones do get altered. So you can't always just rely on, I'm intuitively eating and trying to pay attention to hunger and fullness here. You do typically want to, even if it has to be a little bit forced, trying to get in something. And then food wise, like you can always do like soy milk or nut milk with protein powder. A higher protein soup in the winter is something I recommend. So you can make a big batch of soup, make sure it has, it could have beans, or you could have it with bread. And then you could add protein powder to get the protein up, or if it has meat, etc. So just looking at that soup option, making a bigger batch, freezing some portions, having some of that soup post longer effort in the winter. And then, like hard-boiled eggs with dried fruit, yogurt with fruit, and granola, etc. It doesn't have to be complicated or novel. So your key takeaways should be fueling strategies should be sport specific and individualized. So you need to take into account all of those things that I was talking about. if you're mountain biking, if you're Nordic skiing, like what are all these little nuances for the different sports that need to be taken into account. And then I didn't even go into like, body size and your sweat rate and all of that. Like those things need to be considered as well when you're building your plan. You can have those starting guidelines, but then you need to experiment with how you fit within those guidelines. Pre and post long workout nutrition should be dialed in and practiced before race day. So I always ask people, like, what's your normal race day meal? And they'll tell me, and I'll say, oh, well, have you been doing that in your training? No, I haven't been doing that in my training. I'll just do it on race day. I'm like, why not? Just again, back to what I was saying, if you're able to practice this, you're going to be able to allow yourself to have the least chance of GI distress if you're able to practice everything before that race day consistently. And then fueling plans for inner long workouts and races should be carefully analyzed and practiced before a big effort. 2 weeks before is not the time. You can dial something in, but can't guarantee that's going to work for you. So making sure that you take the time well in advance to look at all of those pieces that I was mentioning. And I highly suggest, I know it sounds obsessive, but I highly suggest creating an Excel sheet like that and breaking everything down for yourself. So then you can have that confidence in knowing, okay, I really looked at this fully and I feel confident in what I'm doing. This kind of fits with those guidelines. So going to move into questions, but just want to mention, if you have any specific questions for me on your own fueling plans, Kylee at flynutrition.org is my email. I am on Instagram at Flynutrition3, and then I have a Fly Nutrition Endurance Sports Nutrition community that you can be a part of if you're an endurance athlete and want to gain some additional knowledge about things. So go see if there is some question.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Kylee. This is awesome. Quick side note before I show the questions is that I went in and downloaded your real food blends for feeling while you were presenting, and all of them look amazing. I'm excited to try them myself. So definitely recommend. Yeah, the maple apple cinnamon looks delicious, and I think will be super helpful.
Yeah, they're a great option for those that like don't really like, sticky gels. And again, like those with sensitive stomachs sometimes can handle those things a little bit better. But just keeping in mind with any of those things that, again, that fructose content will play a role. And so fruit does contain fructose. So making sure that like your drink mix and analyzing those things in regards to how much like the sugar makeup of the things you're choosing.
Totally. So we do have a couple of questions, and I'll just start with the ones, I'll just go in order that they came in. The first question is from Emily, and she is asking, what happens when you don't do any training at the full exertion or distance of your race? For example, you've only ran 20 miles pre-marathon, then in the race, those last 6 miles are where you really struggle. I'm assuming this is referring to nutrition kind of tips around that, kind of like that ending point of a endurance push.
Yeah, and so it's tough because, like with a 100-miler, you're probably not going to be running 100 miles before race day in one long run. So anything, I always say anything can happen on race day, like, GI distress, etc. Like that can all occur. But if you are practicing this kind of fueling plan, we know that it can cause changes in the transporters in the small intestine and your ability to utilize carbohydrates and the choices that you're making. And so doing so and practicing, even if it's only 20 miles, can benefit you. The other thing you could consider, which I didn't mention in the presentation, is if you're worried about like a higher intensity effort and you're not necessarily doing anything long, higher intensity, you could take some of your like gel or hydration option in a hard workout with you. So you could do, if you're doing a tempo run or something, you could practice with a 20-minute tempo. You could do some fueling there to kind of get your body used to a higher intensity and utilization of that fuel then too.
Awesome. Someone else asked, do you run into issues with fructose malabsorption, especially high fructose foods such as watermelon? Which is interesting because a lot of aid stations on races, I feel like watermelon's usually supplied, or other foods just like it. So
yeah, so this is where going back to that individualized approach, there are some folks that do have sensitivities to fructose, and then that fructose malabsorption is a huge issue for them. And so if that is you, then you need to kind of figure out, how am I going to get around that? You may not be able to take in fructose quite as much or even at all, in which case your carbohydrate consumption might be lower than someone else that can handle fructose. I usually mention that it is a little bit risky if I know it's tempting with the oranges and the watermelon, those sorts of things. If you know that you've had issues with fructose in the past, race day is not necessarily the time to be like, oh, I want that so bad and I'm just going to take it, whatever. Because that's where people can get themselves into trouble. If you take a look at your hydration mix and some of the other products that you're utilizing, and they don't contain much fructose, then you might be able to get away with it a little bit more if you're taking like a piece of fruit or two on the course. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Awesome. Someone else asked, keto, paleo, and other low carb, high fat, and protein diets have grown in popularity over the years. What are your thoughts on the safety of these long term, especially for endurance athletes?
I kind of this is like a loaded topic for sure, and it's highly controversial in the endurance community. I think with where the research is at now, I think some athletes, it can actually work for them, and I don't know whether that is a genetic thing or if there really is something to it. But right now where the research is at, it is showing that carbohydrates are still going to be the recommended preferred fuel source or recommendation for endurance activity. Now there is also exploration into utilization of kind of that train low with low carbohydrate availability, but also like strategic usage of carbohydrates during your training to maybe help with metabolic adaptations and fat utilization. That is still being studied as well. But there could potentially be some benefit to doing training with low carbohydrate at lower intensity efforts during your training cycle. But again, with higher intensity, we still do see like power loss in cycling events, inability to hold paces that you normally would be able to hold for running events. So again, long term, don't know for sure. It still appears though that carbohydrates are going to be that preferred source of fuel for endurance activity. Ultra endurance activity, maybe a slight shift in regards to how many carbs per hour, and then utilization of protein and fat during activity could be utilized as part of your strategy.
Great. Yeah, this is a topic that we've published a bit about just on our own blog as well. So
awesome.
People can dive in there. There's another question. Are there any suggestions on overcoming sloshy belly in very long events? So someone's saying sloshy belly from referring to the normal amounts of fluids.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because again, that's kind of getting into, you could be off already. If you're at that point, you could have been off on your intake of calorie, carbohydrate, your osmolality of your solution could have been off. Your electrolyte intake could have been off as well. typically at that point, it would be a matter of maybe trying not to take in too much fluid, and trying to see if you can get that to resolve. Again, like when I work through some of these challenge areas with athletes, I like to kind of say, you know, when you're at that point, that's not necessarily where you want to be. You want to, if you're at that point, you might have to reduce your intensity, your pace, to be able to recover from something like sloshy belly or stomach cramps, etc. Not what people want to hear, but unfortunately there's like not a ton of, there's no magic cure to that either.
Awesome. So those are all the questions. I don't know if anyone has any others. I guess this is your last chance. So feel free to type them out in the chat box or the Q&A box if you do. And if you don't, then thank you so much. This was an awesome clinic. There's a couple of comments in the chat box saying that people really appreciated your presentation and your clinic. So I think everyone's super stoked on all the information that you provided.
Awesome. And I hope that it was applicable. So, you know, again, that education piece, but that application piece, you know, and thinking about how can I take some of these things that I just chatted about, and put them into other people's lives. How can they apply that to their sport and their own fueling plan? So don't just like read this, but go out and actually apply it to your own training. And I guarantee you it's going to benefit you.
Yeah, practice definitely helps a ton. I'm into endurance cycling, and it's definitely helpful to build it up before the actual big push. So yes, I like that. I like that tip. But awesome. Well, thank you, Kylee. And if anyone else, if anyone has any questions that they think of after the fact, feel free to hit Kylee up on Instagram or through her email.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks. You too.
Bye.